12:30, and rain moving in from the west in short, decided gusts, striking the window in Baker Street at no fixed interval I have yet been able to determine. Below, on the sill, water sits in a groove worn by some 11 years of exactly this weather, a groove perhaps a 1/16 of an inch deep, which tells you more about 11 years of rain than any diary would trouble to. It is commonly supposed that a great city sleeps between midnight and 6. It does nothing of the kind. A very considerable fraction of London is on its feet at this hour, doing the work that will have the rest of it fed, lit, informed and moving by the time it wakes. And I have never understood why a city so entirely dependent on these people knows so little about them, which is reason enough to sit up and set some of it down. I could, I suppose, simply list them from memory, as a naturalist lists species without leaving his study, and save us both the walk. I have chosen not to. A fact observed at the place it happens carries a weight that the same fact recited from an armchair never quite manages, and since neither of us is sleeping regardless, I would rather you had the genuine article than my paraphrase of it. Below, the last of the public houses along the Marylebone Road are turning out their custom. Licensing hours end at 12:30 in this part of town, and a landlord who ignores the clock loses his licence at the next sessions, which concentrates the mind more effectively than any sermon. There is a particular sound to a public house closing, not shouting, whatever the temperance pamphlets would have you believe, but a kind of settling, chairs scraping back, a door held open against the wind, 4 or 5 voices lowering themselves out of habit rather than instruction. Most of what passes for rowdiness in this city between midnight and 1 is simply cold men trying to get home before the cold gets worse. I watch one landlord bolt his door, top and bottom, and stand a moment on his own step with his coat collar up, looking up and down an empty street he has looked up and down every night for some years, checking it the way another man might check a lock he has already tried twice. He will be up again before 6, laying his fires and rinsing his glasses before the first custom of the new day arrives, and I have long thought publicans keep hours that would ruin most other professions, though nobody thinks to call it a trade requiring stamina, which it plainly is. Inside, before the last lamp is turned down, a potman is already stacking the night's glasses into a tub for washing, and a barmaid counts the till against a slip of paper twice, once quickly and once slowly, the second count always the one she trusts, a small private discipline of double-checking that I recognise from my own work and rarely see acknowledged as the discipline it is when practised behind a bar rather than a magnifying glass. Before I turn to any of that, though, a word about where I am, since a man narrating from a first-floor window owes his listener at least that much orientation. This street has stood, in more or less its current form, for something under a century, laid out on fields that were, within living memory of men not yet especially old, still fields, and it retains, even now, a slightly provisional air, as though the city had not entirely finished deciding what kind of street it meant this to be. I have lived at my present address for some years, long enough that the landlady's dog no longer barks at my step on the stair, which I count as a more meaningful measure of tenure than any lease. Further along, a theatre I passed some hours earlier, before this narrative properly began, has gone dark at the front and is very much awake at the back. The audience left before 11, coats collected, cabs called, the building to all appearances finished for the night. It is not finished. Behind the darkened front of house, men are striking a set that must come down entirely, and a different one go up before tomorrow's rehearsal, moving painted flats and weighted braces through a space too cramped and too dim, by any sensible standard, for the speed at which they are required to move it. A scene shifter who lets a flat fall on a night like this does more damage to the week's takings than a poor notice in the morning papers ever could, and the men who do this work are paid, on the whole, a good deal less than the actors whose evening they made possible, a discrepancy I record without further comment, since I promised myself I would not use tonight as an occasion for grievance, and intend, for once, to keep the promise. At the stage door, a keeper sits in a cubbyhole barely large enough for his chair and his ledger, waiting for the last of the company to leave before he can lock up properly, and he will tell you, if asked, the name and habits of every performer who has passed through that door in the last 20 years, a private archive of the theatre's history kept entirely in one man's memory and worth. I suspect a good deal more to a biographer than anything written down in a programme. He signs each departure against the time in his book, a small, unglamorous formality that exists chiefly so that if anything is ever found to be missing from the building, there is a record of who was still inside when it went missing, and I note once again the same instinct for a checked book that I have now found in a police station, a bonded warehouse, and a market inspector's round. 4 entirely separate trades, having independently settled on the same simple defence against the ordinary dishonesty of the world. Most of the lamps along this street still burn gas, fed from mains laid under the road some decades ago, though a handful of thoroughfares elsewhere in the city have lately taken to electric light instead. A brighter, harder white that I find impressive as engineering and rather unkind as illumination, since it leaves nothing whatsoever to the eye's own imagination, and a street, I have come to think, is entitled to keep a little of itself back. The gas lamp outside my own window has a particular soft unsteadiness to its flame that no electric lamp has yet managed to reproduce, and I do not know whether to call that a shortcoming of the newer technology or simply an honest admission that it was never trying to do the same job in the first place. A four-wheeler passes below my window, going west. The horse's shoes loud on the wet stone in the particular way iron is loud on granite sets and almost silent on wood paving, a distinction the borough surveyors understand a great deal better than the average pedestrian. The cab does not stop. Its lamps swing once at the corner and are gone, and the street returns to what it was, which is rain and a gas lamp 3 doors down doing its modest best against both. You will have noticed this yourself, if you have ever stood at a window at an hour you were not supposed to be awake for, how a street empties not all at once but in layers, the respectable trade first, then the last cab, then nothing for a while but weather. I find the interval that follows more interesting than either end of it. It is not empty. It only looks that way from a first-floor window. I am going to walk. Boots, coat. The muffler my brother considers an affectation, and I consider correct dress for a night with this much water in it. Baker Street at 10 to 1 has a hush to it that has nothing supernatural about it, and everything to do with paving, drainage, and the fact that this particular parish spent a good deal of money 40 years ago rebuilding its road surface for exactly this purpose. I mention this because it is the kind of fact that explains a feeling, which is the only kind of fact worth having. At the corner, a constable of the Metropolitan Police stands under the lamp, not sheltering from the rain so much as declining to acknowledge it, which is a different thing entirely and a more useful one for a man on an 8-hour beat. He has a fixed route, timed to the minute, and a sergeant who will check him at certain points along it whether he is there or not, which is the entire discipline of the thing in a sentence. I ask him nothing. He nods. I nod. This is the whole of our acquaintance, repeated on most nights I'm awake to have it, and I have come to value it more than several friendships that required considerably more conversation. The Metropolitan Police, since their founding some 60-odd years ago, replaced a parish watch that was, by most honest accounts, elderly, underpaid, and frequently asleep in its own box. I will not pretend the change was universally welcomed. A uniformed force patrolling the streets of a free city struck a great many respectable people as an affront when it was first proposed, and it took some years and a good deal of ordinary visible competence. Doors checked, drunks walked home rather, then left in the gutter, fires reported before they spread, to persuade London that the affront was worth the safety. It generally is. I note this and move on, because a man who lingers on the history of an institution while standing in the rain has mistaken his priorities. The constable's beat covers something over 2 miles in the hour, at a pace fixed by regulation rather than preference, testing doors as he goes, a shop, a warehouse, the side entrance of a bank, with a particular economical motion of the wrist that a young constable takes some weeks to acquire, and an old one performs without appearing to think about it at all. He carries a lantern with a shutter that turns a beam on and off without extinguishing the flame inside, a small piece of engineering that has saved him more trouble than his truncheon ever will, since most of his work is not apprehension, but simply being seen to be there. A door found unlocked, a light burning where no light should be, a window standing open in weather like this. These are noted, followed up, and very often nothing whatsoever, and he checks them all the same, every night, for years, because the one time in 100 is the only one that matters and there is no way to know in advance which night that will be. He has issued a rattle by some division still, and a whistle by others, the force being in the middle of a slow changeover from one to the other, and he will tell you, if you ask him nicely enough on a dry night, that the whistle carries further and tires the arm considerably less, which strikes me as exactly the kind of practical improvement that takes an institution 20 years to adopt, and 20 seconds to justify once adopted. I did not ask him tonight. The rain made conversation an imposition neither of us wanted. A short distance along, the station house for this division keeps its own lamp burning blue over the door, a colour chosen, I have always understood, precisely because it is the one colour least likely to be mistaken for anything else on a foggy night. Inside, an inspector sits at a high desk with the night's occurrence book open in front of him, a ledger into which every complaint, every drunk brought in, every lost child later reclaimed, is entered in a hand as level at 4 a.m. as at midnight, because the book will be read by his superiors in daylight and judged on its neatness quite as much as its content, which strikes me as a faintly absurd standard, and one he has clearly long since stopped resenting. A jailer moves along a short corridor of cells, mostly empty tonight, checking each through a small barred grille at intervals fixed by regulation rather than curiosity. The same 40-minute discipline I noted earlier in the bank watchman, which tells you that somewhere in this city's administration, somebody worked out a long time ago that 40 minutes is about the longest interval at which a man can be trusted to remember he is meant to be paying attention. I exchange a few words with the inspector, an old acquaintance of sorts, and decline his offer of a chair by the stove, since I have a good deal further to walk tonight, and a chair by a stove is precisely the kind of comfort that ends a night's observation prematurely. Rain finds the gap between collar and neck with the precision of a thing that has done this before. At the crossing, I stop a moment to let a solitary dray pass, the carter perched high above his load with a sack over his shoulders against the wet, reins held loosely in hands that have long since stopped needing to grip them tightly for a horse, this well accustomed to the round. Somewhere off to the east, muffled by distance and by several intervening streets, a train sounds its whistle on a stretch of line I could not name with any confidence, and the note carries for a second or two longer than seems entirely reasonable before the city absorbs it back into itself. I turn down toward the cab rank at the end of the street, less from any need of a cab than from the fact that a cab rank at 1 a.m. is one of the more instructive places in London, and instruction is what I am out for tonight. A hansom differs from the heavier four-wheeler in almost every particular that matters to the men who drive them. 2 wheels rather than 4, the driver seated high at the back rather than up front. The passengers enclosed ahead of him in a cab. He steers and brakes by cords run back to his own hands. Designed some 60 years old now and improved upon steadily enough in that time that the current version bears only a family resemblance to the original. It is faster over a short distance than a four-wheeler, lighter on the horse, and considerably worse for luggage, which is why a traveller bound for a terminus with trunks generally wants the four-wheeler, and a gentleman bound for his club with nothing but himself generally wants the hansom, a distinction every driver on this rank understands before a fare has said a single word, simply from the look of the person hailing him. 4 hansoms stand in a line, their drivers not in the cabs but out of them, gathered under the awning of a small green hut not much larger than a bathing machine, from which issues a smell of coffee and toasted bread that does more for the character of Baker Street at this hour than anything the Borough Council has managed. This is a cabman's shelter, and I will admit to a fondness for them that a man of my temperament ought perhaps to be more embarrassed about than he is. They began some years ago, established by subscription, a clergyman and a peer among the founders, if memory serves, moved by the plain fact that a cabman on a wet night had nowhere respectable to get a hot drink, since he could not leave his horse to go into a public house, and a public house was not always where a sensible man wanted him to go in any case. The huts are built to a fixed size, small enough to stand at the curb without requiring a permit for obstruction of the highway, which is the sort of practical compromise that tells you a great deal about how this city actually gets things done, one grudging inch of pavement at a time. No spirits are sold inside. Coffee, cocoa, bread, a chop, if the keeper is willing to fry one, and a bench to sit on out of the weather, which on a night like this is worth more than the cocoa. I said I would digress once tonight, and this is as good a place as any. The size restriction on these shelters is not incidental. It is the entire reason they exist at all in the form they do. A structure larger than a horse and cart standing on a public highway would have required parliamentary sanction, or at least a great deal more argument with the vestry than anyone had patience for, and so the shelters were built to exactly the dimensions the law allowed for a stationary vehicle, and no more. It is a small dry piece of legislative history, and it produces, on a wet night, one of the more genuinely warm sights the city offers. 4 tired men with their knees against a narrow counter, steam coming off wet wool, a stove doing more good than the entire Metropolitan Board of Works. I return you now to the street as promised. The cabmen themselves are worth the attention nobody thinks to give them. A hansom driver works a fare that is fixed by statute, not by negotiation, which sounds a small thing until you have watched a man refuse a drunk's extra shilling because the fare, such as the law sets it, is what it is and no more. He knows every court and mews within a 2-mile radius of wherever he keeps his rank, knows which streets flood in this kind of rain, and which corners a heavy 4-wheeler cannot take without scraping its hub, knows his horse's temper better than most men know their own children's, and he has been out since before the theatres closed, and will be out some hours yet, in weather that would keep a sensible man indoors, because the fares that pay best are precisely the fares that come at the worst hours. I have never met a cabman who considered this a hardship worth mentioning. It is simply the trade, and he is good at it, in a way that deserves rather more notice than it gets from the people he delivers safely home. A good many of the cabs on this rank are not owned outright by the men driving them, but rented by the day from a proprietor who keeps a yard of vehicles and horses for exactly this purpose, and a fair number of those are worked in 2 shifts on the same vehicle, a day man and a night man sharing 1 cab and 1 pair of horses between them, meeting at a fixed hour to hand the whole concern over, horse, harness, and any small defect in the woodwork worth mentioning, with a brevity that comes from having done the same handover several 100 times before. The night man pays his proprietor a fixed sum for the privilege of the vehicle, regardless of what the night's takings turn out to be, which means every. Fare he fails to find is a loss entirely his own, an arrangement that would strike most clerks as an intolerable risk to carry nightly, and strikes every cabman I have ever discussed it with as simply the trade, no more remarkable than the weather. A trough stands a little further along the curb, kept filled by the parish for exactly this purpose, and one of the horses drinks from it at length while its driver checks a shoe that has been troubling him since his last fare, running a thumb round the rim of it with the same unhurried attention. I watch the horsekeeper give his own stall some streets back. A cabman who neglects his horse loses his living considerably faster than one who neglects his manners, and I have never once, across a great many nights like this one, seen a cabman treat his horse with anything less than the particular rough tenderness of a man who understands, better than most owners of anything, exactly what he owes the animal keeping him fed. One of the 4, an older man with a beard going the colour of the weather, is telling the others something involving a fare, a lost glove, and a return journey of some 4 miles undertaken at no charge because the lady in question had been kind to his horse. I do not hear the end of it. I'm not meant to. A cab rank at 1 in the morning has its own conversation, and I am a guest in it, not a participant, and there is a kind of company to be had simply from standing at the edge of other people's ordinary talk, unremarked, which I recommend to anyone who cannot sleep and does not wish to be alone with the reason why. Rain on a tin roof has a different note than rain on slate, lower and somehow more resigned, and the shelter's roof produces exactly that note for as long as I stand near it. A brougham comes past at a pace considerably faster than the weather recommends, and I recognise it, or rather recognise the type of it, before I recognise the man inside, since a doctor's brougham has a particular urgency to its driving that a cabman's does not, the horse pushed harder than an ordinary fare would ever ask for. A physician roused from his bed at this hour is very often bound for a birth rather than a death, the 2 events sharing in this city very nearly the same disregard for the clock, and I have long thought a family doctor deserves rather more credit than he receives for maintaining, across a career of 30 or 40 years, the capacity to rise at any hour of the night, dress, think clearly, and perform careful work on no more than a few hours' broken sleep strung together across a week. It is not a skill taught in any lecture hall. It is acquired the way most of the competences I have shown you tonight are acquired, by doing the thing itself, badly at first and then less badly, until one day it no longer feels remarkable to be entirely awake and entirely useful, at 3 in the morning. Behind the shelter, in a mews I know reasonably well, a horsekeeper is going through the stalls of an omnibus company's stable with a lantern, checking each animal in turn, feed, water, a hoof lifted and inspected without any fuss on either side. Because the first omnibus of the morning leaves this yard before 6, and a lame horse discovered at 5:30 is a far worse discovery than one caught now. The company keeps far more horses than it keeps vehicles, since a horse pulling a loaded omnibus through a full day's traffic tyres in a way an engine does not, and is changed out partway through the round, which means a yard like this one is never entirely still, only quieter between the changes than during them. The man doing the checking has done it, he tells me without much interest in being asked, for the better part of 19 years, and has, in that time, formed opinions about individual horses that would surprise their owners, who mostly think of them as identical brown engines rather than 19 years of separately remembered temperaments. State the fact and give it the one inference it permits. A horsekeeper who can tell by lantern light at 1 a.m. that a particular animal is not quite herself tonight, before any lameness or fever has declared itself plainly, is exercising a diagnostic skill that took him the better part of 2 decades to acquire, and that no examination in this city would trouble to certify. I decline to develop the comparison to more celebrated professions any further than that. Further into the yard, Farrier's forge stands cold at this hour but ready. Coals banked rather than out, since a horse found lame at 5:30 needs shoeing before the first journey, not after it, and a forge that must be lit from nothing wastes 20 minutes an omnibus company cannot afford to lose. Harness hangs along one wall in a row so uniform it might have been measured with instruments, each set oiled and mended the previous evening by a saddler, whose entire trade consists of small repairs nobody notices until the one strap that was not repaired gives way at the worst possible moment on the worst possible hill, and I have come, over the course of this single night, to think that a very great deal of London's smooth running depends on precisely this category of person, the one who fixes the thing before it breaks, and is therefore never thanked for having fixed anything at all. I walk on, south now, past a bank whose entrance is guarded at this hour by a watchman I have some slight acquaintance with, seated in a small lodge just inside the glass, a lamp turned low beside him, and a clock he checks against his own pocket, watch at intervals, I timed once, out of curiosity, at almost exactly 40 minutes. His employment consists, on the vast majority of nights, of nothing happening at all, which is precisely the point of it, and precisely why it is so poorly regarded as work. A watchman is paid to be the reason nothing happens, and a profession whose entire success is invisible will never get the credit a policeman gets for an arrest, or a fireman for a rescue, though the discipline required to sit alone in a small room for 8 hours, genuinely alert rather than merely present, is not a small one. I have tried it myself once, as an experiment in patience rather than necessity, and lasted 4 hours before I understood exactly why these men are paid what they are paid and not less. 2 streets further on, a similar lodge, this one attached to a warehouse of some size, and a different watchman, younger, doing his rounds with a lantern and what I take to be a detector clock, a device not uncommon now in premises of any value, that requires him to turn a key at fixed stations around the building at fixed times, the whole recorded on a paper dial locked inside the clock itself, so that his employer may confirm the next morning that the rounds were actually made and not merely claimed. It is not a flattering piece of machinery, in the sense that it exists because someone, somewhere, was once paid to walk a route and did not walk it, and I find something almost touching in the fact that the honest watchmen, which is to say nearly all of them, submit to being checked in this way without complaint, understanding it as the cost of a trade built on trust that cannot, in the nature of things, always be extended on faith alone. Between the warehouse and the gasworks, a building site occupies half a street on land cleared some months ago for a new block of offices, and a watchman sits beside it on an upturned crate, a coke brazier glowing at his feet, its light doing rather more for the character of the street than the single distant lamp the parish has provided. His duty is to see that nothing is taken from a site stocked with lead, timber and tools worth a considerable sum to anyone with a cart and no scruples, and he does it, on a night like this, mostly by staying visibly and unmistakably awake beside a fire that can be seen from either end of the street, which is a simpler and rather older form of security than the detector clocks I described a moment ago, and no less effective for it. He offers me a share of the brazier's warmth without being asked, in the same unthinking way the baker will offer me bread some hours from now, and I have noticed, over a good many nights like this one, that the men with the least to spare are almost always the readiest to share what little of it they have. Past the warehouse, a gasworks throws its own low orange light against the underside of the cloud, and I stop a moment at the railing to look in, since the engineer on duty here is responsible, in a very literal sense, for every lamp I have walked past tonight, mine included. The pressure in the mains must be held steady through hours when demand falls almost to nothing and then rises sharply again as the city wakes, and the man watching the gauges does so alone, in a shed lit, appropriately enough, by the very thing he is producing, adjusting. Valves by increments too small for me to follow from where I stand. A waterworks engineer some streets further on keeps a near-identical vigil over the pressure that will, in a few hours, fill several 100,000 kettles, and I have never once heard either trade mentioned in the same breath as the ones the newspapers consider heroic, though a failure in either, on a night as cold as this one, would be noticed by every household in the district within the hour, and a success is noticed by nobody at all, which is by now a pattern you will have started to recognise without my troubling to point it out again. The bell of a fire station reaches me before the station itself does, not an alarm, only the ordinary bell that marks a change of watch, and I detour the length of one street to look in, because a fire station at night is among the better-run enterprises in London, and deserves to be seen as such rather than only in the moment of an emergency, which is the only moment most people ever picture it in. Inside, the horses stand already harnessed, or harnessed to within a buckle or two of ready, because the time between an alarm sounding and the engine clearing the door is measured in a small number of seconds, and every one of those seconds not spent on harness is a second that might matter somewhere across the city. The collars hang open on a hinge above each stall, so that a horse need only walk forward into its place and the collar drops and closes around it. A piece of stable engineering I have always thought deserved more admiration than it receives, being exactly the kind of invention that saves a life by saving 11 seconds nobody watching will ever know were saved. The men on duty do not sleep in bed so much as on frames, that tip them out and toward their boots the instant the alarm is struck. A piece of furniture I find more honestly designed than most, since it does not pretend comfort is the object. A watch is kept in strict rotation through the night, one man always awake and dressed at the door while the others rest, so that the alarm, whenever it comes, finds at least one pair of eyes already open and one pair of boots already on, a small redundancy built into the station's own routine that costs the men themselves a great deal more broken sleep than any of them would think to complain about. One fireman, awake and doing nothing in particular by the light of a single lamp, oils a length of hose with the unhurried attention of a man who understands that the hose that fails is always the hose that was neglected on a quiet night rather than a busy one. Another, further down the room, is reading a newspaper some hours old, not for the news, since he has read it twice already, but for the same reason any of us reread a thing at 3 a.m, which is that it is easier than sitting with nothing at all. I ask the first man nothing, and he offers nothing, and we regard each other for perhaps 10 seconds in a manner I found afterward oddly restful. Down at the river a separate station keeps a fire float moored and ready, a steam vessel built to fight fires along the wharves and among shipping where no land engine could ever reach, crewed through the night by men who sleep, when they sleep at all, within arm's reach of a boiler kept always a little warm, so that raising full steam takes minutes rather than the better part of an hour a cold boiler would demand. I have not seen this float called out tonight, and hope, for everyone's sake along that stretch of river, that I do not. A short distance from the station proper, under a covered stand of its own, a street fire escape stands ready, one of a number posted at intervals across the district, tended by a conductor who lodges close enough to reach it within a minute of any alarm being raised nearby, whether or not it is his own station's bell that raises it. His trade consists almost entirely of being asleep lightly enough to wake at the right sound, and correctly enough dressed to be running within moments of doing so, which sounds a slight kind of skill until you have tried to sustain it, year after year, without ever quite knowing which night will be the one that tests it. You will have felt something like this yourself, I think, if you have ever done a piece of ordinary maintenance late at night for no better reason than that it needed doing, and you happen to be the one awake to do it. I do not stay. There is a stretch of river some minutes further on that I find I want tonight, not for any case attached to it, since there is none, but because the Thames at night keeps its own night trade entirely separate from the streets, and a night given to night work would be incomplete without it. The tide, not the clock, governs the river, and a lighterman who has spent 30 years on it, will tell you the state of it by the sound of the water against the stairs before he troubles to look. Barges are worked at whatever hour the tide permits, loaded and unloaded by men who think nothing of starting at 2 a.m. if that is when the water allows it, because a barge caught by a falling tide in the wrong stretch of river sits fast in the mud until the water returns at considerable cost to everyone whose goods are aboard it. A waterman I've spoken with on other nights described judging his approach to a flight of stone stairs, slick with weed, in the dark, by feel and memory rather than sight, a skill he clearly regarded as unremarkable, and I regard as exactly the kind of trained, invisible competence this whole night has been assembled to point at. Further along the wharf, 2 lighter men are working a barge loose from its moorings by pole and rope alone, no engine to help them, judging the exact moment the current will carry the vessel clear of the wharf without needing to be told, a coordination between 2 men who have plainly worked together for years and exchange perhaps 4 words the entire time I watch them, none of which I catch and none of which, I suspect, was strictly necessary. A lighterman's apprenticeship runs the better part of 7 years before he is trusted with a barge of his own, longer than most learned professions require of their students, for a trade that the average passer-by on a bridge above would struggle to describe beyond calling it, dismissively, boat work. A police boat passes low and slow, a lantern at the bow throwing a modest cone of light across water the colour of the sky above it, which is to say no colour worth naming yet. The river division keeps its own hours entirely separate from the beats ashore, its work concerned with wharves, moored craft, and the particular kind of trouble that only a stretch of tidal water thick with cargo can generate, and I have always thought it among the least understood branches of the force, in part because so few people ever see it working, being by the nature of its territory largely invisible from any street. Along the wharf, a customs watchman patrols a line of bonded warehouses holding goods on which duty has not yet been paid, a responsibility that makes his rounds a matter of revenue as much as safety, and he checks each seal on each door with the same 40-minute discipline I have now noted in 3 separate trades tonight, which I begin to suspect is less a coincidence than a fact about human attention that the whole of this city has independently arrived at from 3 different directions. He tells me when I ask that the worst nights are not the cold ones but the still dry ones, since a still night carries sound and smell further across water and gives a careless intruder nowhere to hide his approach, a small piece of professional wisdom I had not previously had reason to consider, and was glad, on reflection, to be given. Water against stone, unhurried, indifferent to whatever hour a clock somewhere insists it is. This stretch of river handles across a full year a volume of shipping I will not attempt to state in figures, since any number precise enough to be worth quoting is also precise enough to be wrong by the time I quote it, trade of this scale shifting month to month with the seasons and the state of the world beyond this island. I will say only that it is considerable, that a great deal of it is worked at night for reasons of tide rather than preference, and that the men who work it are, almost without exception, entirely unrecorded by name in any account of this city's greatness, their trade being the sort that keeps the greatness supplied rather than the sort that gets written about. I turn back from the river toward the hospital whose night wards I have visited before, on business that had nothing to do with illness, and everything to do with a patient who could not be moved and a conversation that could not wait for morning, and I find myself wanting to see it again tonight on no business at all, which is a novelty. Near the main gate, a separate lamp burns over a smaller door marked for casualties, kept lit through the night for the sort of ordinary misfortune that does not wait for morning surgery hours, a cut, a fall, a burn from a kitchen fire banked too high. A porter here doubles as the first point of judgment for who is seen at once and who may reasonably wait a few minutes, a triage performed with no medical training whatsoever, beyond years of watching what the doctors themselves prioritize, and performed, in my limited observation of it, rather better than the description suggests it ought to be. I will not describe what brings anyone through that door tonight beyond saying that it is nothing worse than the ordinary run of a large city's ordinary bad luck, and I mention the door chiefly to note that it is staffed, lit and ready at every hour without exception, which is a form of readiness this city rarely stops to be grateful for. A porter admits me at the side door, hospitals of any size keeping a night entrance separate from the day one, for reasons that become obvious the moment you consider what sort of arrival typically requires one. and the corridor beyond has the particular hush of a building fully staffed and almost entirely still, gas turned low along its length, footsteps deliberately softened on stone that was not designed with softness in mind. A night sister passes with a lamp shielded on one side by her own hand, a small practical gesture that tells you everything about a profession built around not waking the one patient in 20 who has finally, blessedly, managed to sleep. The night nursing staff in a hospital of this size will be a fraction of the day's complement, covering wards that the daylight roster would consider undermanned for anything short of an emergency, and doing so on the unspoken understanding that an emergency is exactly what they must be ready for at any moment between the last round and the first. I watched, once, a night sister manage a ward of some 30 beds alone for the better part of an hour, while a junior nurse was occupied elsewhere, moving between two patients whose conditions she clearly judged worth watching. More closely than the rest, checking a pulse here, addressing there, writing nothing down until she had a free minute in which to write it properly rather than snatching at the record between patients, and risking an error that could matter a great deal more than the 10 minutes delay. This is not heroism, in the sense the word gets used in the penny papers. It is simply competence, exercised alone, at 3 a.m, by someone nobody outside that ward will ever hear named. The training that produces her is comparatively recent, the older custom of nursing by untrained women hired more for availability than skill having given way, over the last few decades, to a formal course of instruction, examination, and probation before a woman is trusted with a ward of her own, and I have watched the change happen within my own lifetime with the particular satisfaction of a man who likes to see a trade take itself seriously. She would not, I think, describe her own work as remarkable. She would tell you, if pressed, that she has simply done her rounds, in the same tone the constable uses for his beat and the sorter for his tray, and I have come to recognise that particular flatness of self-description as the surest sign, in any trade, that the person speaking is genuinely good at it. Further along the same corridor, a second sister sits at a small table with a lamp turned close over a ledger, entering the night's observations in a hand so precise it might have been engraved rather than written, a discipline I recognise from my own case notes and rarely see matched outside them. She does not look up as I pass. I do not expect her to. There is a particular courtesy in being allowed to observe a person entirely absorbed in doing their work correctly, without being obliged to perform any awareness of an audience, and I try, when I can, to extend it rather than interrupt it. Somewhere above, a bell rings twice, a summons for the resident house surgeon rather than an alarm, and a young man passes me on the stair a moment later, coat over his nightshirt, moving at the particular controlled speed of someone who has trained himself never to run in a hospital corridor no matter how urgent the reason, since a running doctor frightens patients who are trying very hard not to be frightened. He will have been on duty since the previous morning and will remain on duty until the next one begins, sleeping, if he sleeps at all, in a small room kept for exactly that purpose and fitted with a bell that answers to every ward in the building, which strikes me as a form of employment closer to a soldier's than a physician's, and one that the young man in question did not pause to remark upon as he passed, having, I imagine, long since stopped expecting anyone to. A clock in the corridor ticks with a heaviness that suggests it has not been oiled in some time, and nobody has thought to mention it, because everyone in the building has long since stopped hearing it at all. I take my leave before I'm asked my business, which is generally the correct moment to take one's leave of a hospital, and walk on by a route that takes me past a large building I will not name precisely, since naming it precisely would do it no kindness, where a different sort of night work goes on with rather less comfort attached to it. This is a casual ward, attached to the workhouse, where any person without shelter for the night may apply for admission, a task in exchange for it the next morning, and a bed that is, by any honest description, a poor one. A superintendent is on duty through the night, admitting late arrivals, keeping order in a dormitory of men who have nowhere else to be, a task that requires a particular kind of patience I do not think I possess myself, and admire rather more on reflection than I admire a good many better paid forms of authority in this city. A woman ahead of me in the short queue at the door carries a child asleep against her shoulder, and the superintendent admits both without any of the questions I half expect, having plainly seen enough nights like this one to know exactly which questions can wait until morning, and which need never be asked at all. I will not dwell on this longer than the fact requires, since poverty appears in tonight's account because honesty demands it, not because I intend to make a spectacle of it, and I do not. The rain, I notice, has thinned to something closer to mist, and I am glad enough to press on toward warmer business. Fleet Street next, because I want you to see something that happens every night of the year, regardless of what has happened in it, which is the production of tomorrow's newspaper. A great many people who read a morning paper over their breakfast have never once considered how it came to be sitting there, warm from the press, containing an account of a debate that concluded in the Commons at 11 the previous night. The answer is that a considerable number of men did not go to bed so that it could. The building I am thinking of runs its presses through the small hours, and has done, in one form or another, for the better part of a century. Inside, past a hall that smells of ink and hot metal and wet paper in roughly equal measure, compositors stand at cases of type, each letter picked out by hand from a box divided into more compartments than most men could name without looking, and set into a line, and the line into a column, and the column locked into a frame, all of it done at a speed that looks, to an untrained eye, indistinguishable from carelessness, and is in fact the product of years spent doing one thing, until the hands no longer consult the mind about how to do it. A fast compositor can set type faster than most men can write it out longhand, and he does this standing up for hours, in a room lit by gas because daylight will not arrive until his work is finished. State the fact plainly. The debate that ends in Parliament at 11 has, by 3 or 4 in the morning, been reported, set, proofed, corrected, and locked into a page ready for the press. The inference is equally plain that a great many careers are staked nightly on doing accurately and at speed work that the reader will spend perhaps 4 minutes glancing at over his eggs and never think about again. I decline to elaborate further on what that ought to suggest about gratitude, since the point makes itself. A proofreader sits apart from the noise of the composing room in a smaller room of his own, a galley proof pulled damp from the press held close to a shaded lamp, reading not for sense, which he has no time to attend to, but for the shape of every individual letter against what the copy in his other hand says it ought to be. An error caught here cost nothing but a minute's correction. An error missed here is set in metal, printed several 100,000 times, and read by a portion of the city as established fact by breakfast, which is a weight of consequence I do not think the proofreader's wages reflect in the slightest, and I say so plainly once and move on. Once the page is set, it is not fed directly under the press, but taken first to a smaller room, where a mould is made of the whole locked frame of type, pressed and dried, and from that mould a curved metal plate is cast to fit the drum of the rotary press, a step that allows several presses to print the same page at once and finish the run in a fraction of the time flat type would require. The men who cast these plates work with molten metal at close quarters, at speed, through the same small hours as everyone else in the building, and I have watched one of them pour a plate, trim it, and have it fitted to its drum in less time than it has taken me to describe the process to you, which I offer as further evidence that description is always the slower of the two activities. A space is left, deliberately, near the foot of one column for whatever arrives too late to have been planned for, a late division in the Commons, a fire, a death of some public importance, and the foreman holds that space open until the very last possible minute the presses will tolerate, weighing, each time, the value of the latest news against the cost of delaying several 100,000 copies to include it. It is a judgment made under real pressure, repeated most nights of the year, by a man whose name will appear nowhere in the paper he's deciding the shape of, and I confess I find that particular invisibility, freely accepted night after night, one of the more quietly admirable arrangements this whole account has shown me. Not everything set tonight originated in this building. A good portion of the later pages comes in by telegraph from correspondents in other cities, transcribed by a clerk the moment it arrives, and carried straight to the composing room while still warm from the wire, so that an event in a provincial town at 10 o'clock may be read over breakfast in London the following morning, as naturally as if it had happened next door. A compression of distance that I suspect will only continue, and that nobody currently living, myself included, has fully adjusted to yet. The presses themselves, when they start, produce a sound that reaches the street even through a closed door, a steady concussive rhythm that a man who works nearby for long enough stops hearing entirely, the way a miller stops hearing his own wheel. Sheets go in blank and white and come out printed, folded and counted, faster than I could describe the process to you if I stood here till dawn trying, and a boy stands ready with a barrow to run the first bundles to the mail trains the moment they are cut, because a newspaper that misses its train has failed at the only part of its business that actually matters at this hour, which is speed. I will grant that pressmen are not, as a class, quiet in their habits or their language, and I do not intend to make them out as saints of industry. But a man who can be trusted night after night to get a fact into cold type correctly, under pressure, at 2 a.m, with no one checking his work but his own foreman and his own conscience, has a competence that deserves the word whether or not he would thank you for using it. Down a side court off Fleet Street, a boy, not a child, though he looks it in this light, more likely 15 or 16, and simply undersized from years of poor feeding, which is its own quiet indictment of the century I decline to develop further, waits with a handcart for the second edition. He stamps his feet against the cold with the particular rhythm of someone counting to keep from thinking about the cold itself, a trick I have used myself on longer vigils than his, though I would not tell him so. A church clock somewhere behind me, muffled by distance and what remains of the rain, strikes 2, some seconds out of true with the one before it, as church clocks in this city have always managed to be, and I suspect always will. Against a long stretch of hoarding round a building site, a bill sticker is at work by the light of a small lantern hung from his own barrow, pasting a fresh sheet advertising some forthcoming entertainment over 3 or 4 older ones, none of which he pauses to read. And I doubt he could tell you, if asked directly, what half of tonight's bills are even advertising. His trade is entirely a matter of coverage and speed. Paste applied in broad even strokes, the sheet smoothed once with a flat brush and never touched again, since a bill left to dry unevenly will bubble and peel within the week, and his employer does not pay him to produce work that peels. He works this same length of hoarding perhaps twice a month, by his own account, and has watched, without any particular sentiment about it, a great many entertainments come and go beneath his own hands, which strikes me as a curious vantage point on this city's fashions, granted to a man nobody would ever think to ask about them. Close by, an eating house that never troubles to lock its door keeps a griddle hot through the entire night, serving the pressmen coming off shift, the cabmen between fares, and anyone else in the district whose hours run contrary to the ordinary run of things. The proprietor, a heavy, unhurried man who has clearly long since stopped being surprised by anything a customer might say to him at 3 a.m, fries chops and eggs at a pace that matches demand without ever quite looking rushed, and keeps, I am told, a slate of small debts for regulars who are short one week and settle the next, a private system of credit built entirely on the same currency the coffee stall runs on, which is simply knowing a man well enough to trust him. I take a cup of tea I did not especially need, mostly for the excuse to sit a few minutes on a bench worn smooth by several thousand other backs before mine, and find it does exactly what I asked of it. The streets between Fleet Street and the terminus are, for a stretch of perhaps 10 minutes walking, genuinely empty in a way little else tonight has been. Shop fronts shuttered, blinds drawn, the occasional cat regarding me from a doorstep with the particular, unhurried contempt cats reserve for anyone abroad, without their own good reason for it. I find I do not mind this interval. A night given over entirely to other people's industry benefits, now and again, from a stretch with nothing in it at all. If only so, the next thing observed can be observed properly, rather than folded into a blur of the last 6. The approach to a great London terminus, some minutes' walk further, is quieter at 3:30 a.m. than at any other hour of its working day, but not empty, and the goods side of the station in particular is thoroughly awake. Milk comes into London overnight in churns, brought by rail from farms a considerable distance out, because a cow does not adjust her habits to suit a city's breakfast table, and the only way to have fresh milk in Marylebone by 7 is to have collected it in the country by 4 the previous afternoon, and moved it through the night to arrive while the streets are still nearly empty enough to move a heavy churn without obstruction. Porters roll the churns off the vans and onto handcarts with a particular economy of motion that avoids both spilling and strain, a skill that looks, to anyone who has tried it without training, considerably harder than it appears, and I have tried it briefly at a porter's amused invitation, and can report that it is a great deal harder than it appears. The churns are collected here by roundsmen, who will spend the next several hours measuring milk out at doorsteps across half a dozen streets, ladling it into whatever jug the household has left out, a transaction repeated some hundreds of times before most of London has finished dressing. Assert, qualify, and withdraw the qualification, as is my habit. It is often said that London's milk supply is the least reliable part of its provisioning. It is not, in point of fact, unreliable at all. It arrives, without fail, every single morning of the year, in every kind of weather this climate can produce, which is precisely the difficulty, since a service that never fails is a service nobody ever thinks to notice. A depot manager, roused for the arrival exactly as I found him, opens a churn at random and tastes a small measure from it before it is allowed onto the roundsman's carts, a check performed on every train's delivery without exception, since a single bad churn sent out to 100 doorsteps would undo, in one morning, a reputation for reliability built up over years. He does this with no more ceremony than a man checking his own tea is properly brewed, and moves on to the next churn the instant he is satisfied, a small unwitnessed act of quality that every household on his round benefits from and not one of them will ever hear about. A parcels office adjoining the goods shed is already sorting the first of the morning's dispatches, a separate trade from the letter mail but run on much the same principle. Packages of every conceivable shape stacked and labelled by a small team working against a departure board fixed to the wall, each entry a train they must not miss. One clerk checks a consignment note against the parcel itself, with a thoroughness that would try the patience of most customers waiting on the other side of the counter, and does so anyway, because a parcel sent to the wrong address is a far worse outcome, for everyone concerned, than a customer kept waiting 3 minutes longer than he would like. A signalman in the box above the goods yard changes a lever with a motion I could watch for longer than is strictly dignified, and a line of wagons somewhere beyond him shunts together with a sound like a very long, very patient sentence being spoken one word at a time. Goods trains run through these hours rather than the day precisely, so that they need not compete with passenger traffic for the same rails, and the men who work them, coupling wagons in the dark by lantern and touch, are performing a task that maims a careless man rather more readily than most trades I've described tonight, which I mention once and plainly, and no more. Mist thinning further over the goods yard now, and a gas lamp near it throwing a soft expanding halo through what remains, which would strike a painter as sentimental, and strikes me only as evidence of moisture in the air, a difference of temperament rather than of observation. The General Post Office presents, from the street at this hour, a long unbroken row of lit windows against a portico most Londoners only ever see by daylight, closed and formal, on their way to post a single letter and think no further about it. At night, the building shows its actual scale rather than its architecture, every one of those windows marking a room in which somebody is still working. And I have always thought, a building looks more honest lit from within at 3 a.m. than it ever does dressed for daylight, since the daylight version is designed to be looked at and the night version simply is what it is. I have not yet spoken of the post office, and it is time I did, because the sorting of the mail is, in large part, a night trade. The letters posted throughout a long day in a city of this size unable to be read, sorted, bagged and dispatched between the last collection and the first delivery, unless a great many people are doing exactly that work while the rest of the city sleeps. Inside the sorting hall, vast, gas-lit, loud in a particular sustained way that has nothing to do with shouting and everything to do with several hundred men moving letters at speed, sorters stand at frames divided into pigeonholes for every district the office serves and flick each letter into its place at a rate that a man untrained to the work could not match if given a week to practice. I watched one sorter clear a tray of some 200 letters in a period of time I would be reluctant to state precisely, for fear of being disbelieved, and will say only that it was considerably less than I expected and considerably more impressive for it. Behind the sorters, canvas mail bags hang open on iron frames, each marked for a particular railway line or district, filling steadily as the pigeonholes empty, and a separate team does nothing but weigh, seal and label these bags once full, working to a departure schedule chalked on a board that is rubbed out and rewritten a dozen times through the course of a single night as trains are added or delayed. There is a great deal of ordinary shouting in this part of the hall, none of it bad-tempered, all of it necessary, since a sealed bag is a decision that cannot easily be undone once made, and a man about to make it wants to be entirely certain at some volume that he has been heard correctly. state the fact and decline to elaborate. A letter posted in the West End before the last collection this evening will, in the ordinary course of things, be in a house on the far side of London before its recipient has finished breakfast, and this happens not because of any single remarkable event, but because several hundred people worked through the night to make an unremarkable thing possible on schedule, which is a higher standard than remarkable and considerably rarer. Beyond the sorting hall, in a smaller room I was permitted into on the strength of an old acquaintance with the superintendent, the telegraph instruments click through the small hours nearly as steadily as by day, since urgent business, a death, a birth, a matter of trade requiring an answer before the markets open, does not arrange itself around anyone's convenience, least of all the operator's. A telegraphist reading a message off the sounder by ear, translating dots and pauses into words at the speed of ordinary speech, is performing a feat of trained attention that I would rank alongside any of the more celebrated skills of my own profession, and I do not say that lightly nor often. She, for a fair number of the operators on this shift are women, keeps a pace across an 8-hour night that would exhaust a man twice her size within the first two, and I have never once heard this remarked upon by anybody drawing a salary for overseeing her. A postman passes me on the pavement outside, working the last collection of the night from the pillar boxes along this route, before the contents go into the building I've just left. Around he walks on foot with a heavy bag that grows heavier at every corner, timed against a schedule printed and pinned inside every box he opens, so that anyone posting a letter may know, to the minute, how long they have before it is too late for tonight's dispatch and must wait for tomorrow's. He unlocks each box with a key kept on a chain at his belt, empties it into the bag without pausing to count what he has collected, relocks it, and moves on, a sequence he could very probably perform with his eyes closed and very possibly, on a night as dark as this one very nearly is. I ask him how many boxes remain on his round, and he tells me, without needing to think about it, a number I have no way of verifying and no reason whatsoever to doubt. He has walked this same sequence of streets in this same order for long enough that he now notices, he tells me, when a single lamp along his route is out before he notices anything else about the street it lights. A small professional distortion of attention that I recognise rather too well from my own habits to find it in any way remarkable. On a bench along the corridor outside, 3 telegraph messenger boys sit in uniform, awake and upright despite the hour, waiting to be sent out with whatever message the instruments next produce, since a telegram is only half delivered the moment it is received on the sounder, the other half being a boy on a bicycle or on foot, running it to a door that may be a mile off, at any hour in any weather, because urgency does not keep office hours, and neither, by extension, does he. One of the 3, perhaps 14, has fallen asleep sitting bolt upright with his cap still on, and the superintendent, passing, does not wake him, on the sound theory that a boy who has run 4 messages already tonight has earned the 2 minutes it will take the next one to be written out. I find this a more humane piece of management than a good many I've observed in better paid establishments, and I say so to the superintendent directly, who looks faintly surprised to be thanked for it, and rather more pleased than he lets on. There is further a service I find genuinely elegant in its mechanism, though I promised only one digression tonight, and have already rather overspent the allowance, so I will state this second one briefly, and hold myself to it. Mail bound for the northern towns is not always carried by a train that stops to collect it. A travelling post office car, staffed by sorters working the letters into district order as the train runs, exchanges its mail with line-side stations by a net apparatus that catches a suspended bag at speed and releases another without the train ever slowing, a piece of engineering so matter-of-fact to the men who operate it, and so faintly astonishing to everyone else that I have never been able to decide which reaction is the more reasonable one. I mention it and put it down again, as instructed, and return you to the street. Markets. I've saved these for the hour that suits them, because a market visited at the wrong time shows you nothing but empty stalls, and the markets of this city are not empty for very much of the night at all. The walk east from the terminus takes the better part of half an hour at my own unhurried pace, through streets that are, by this hour, no longer entirely night but not yet anything I would call morning, a grey interval that has no proper name and ought, I have always thought, to have one. A milk float overtakes me somewhere along the way, the roundsman already well into his own round, and 2 market carts pass going the opposite direction, empty, their night's load already delivered and the drivers now bound for whatever breakfast or bed awaits them. The traffic of this hour runs almost entirely in these 2 directions, toward the markets and away from them, a tide as regular in its way as the one governing the river some streets to the south, and quite as indifferent to anyone's opinion of the hour it keeps. Approaching the market, the streets narrow into a press of wagons queuing to unload, and a constable stands at the worst of the congestion directing traffic by hand signal alone, a different discipline from the beat constable's steady round. Since this work is entirely reactive, judged in the moment, no two mornings arranging themselves in quite the same order. He moves a laden cart forward, holds a lighter one back, waves a porter's barrow through a gap that closes again the instant it has passed, and does all of this without raising his voice once, relying instead on the economy of gesture that every driver in the queue has learned to read at a glance, because a market approach that jams for even 10 minutes costs every trader behind it. Money it will not recover before the morning's trade closes. Billingsgate first, since fish spoils faster than anything else London eats, and therefore governs its own schedule, with a discipline the other trades can only envy. Trading here begins well before most of the city is considered waking, the catch having come up the river or down by rail from the coast overnight, and by 4 the market is in a state of organised uproar that a stranger would mistake for chaos, and a regular would recognise as a system running exactly as intended. Porters carry loads on their heads balanced on a flat leather or wooden pad, moving through a crowd at a pace that would put most sighted pedestrians to shame, calling a warning ahead of them in a single practiced syllable that clears a path more reliably than any amount of shouting would. I watched one porter carry a stack of boxes I would have struggled to lift at all, through a press of bodies, without breaking stride, and I have made a study over the years of exactly this kind of physical competence, and I can tell you it is not brute strength so much as balance, timing, and an intimate bodily knowledge of a floor he has walked 10,000 times before. Nobody applauds him for it. He does it again tomorrow. Among the crowd are buyers who have nothing to do with a household supper at all, agents sent down before dawn by the kitchens of the larger hotels and the better restaurants of the West End, men whose entire professional judgment is exercised in the space of a few seconds per stall, assessing a morning's catch by eye, by smell, and by a brief press of the finger against the flesh, before their establishment has any idea what tonight's dinner menu will even contain. A kitchen of any standing in this city is, in a very real sense, built each evening on a decision made by a tired man in an oilskin coat at 4:30 that same morning, a fact I suspect would astonish a good many diners who imagine their turbot arrived by some more elegant route. A bell somewhere within the market sounds the formal opening of trade, a fixed hour beyond which certain business may not lawfully begin, a small piece of regulation that governs a market otherwise so apparently anarchic that a stranger could be forgiven for assuming it had none. Besides several of the stalls, blocks of ice brought down overnight from stores kept for the purpose, are being broken with mallets and packed around the finer fish, a trade within a trade that exists solely because a catch landed at midnight must still be saleable at market close the following afternoon, and the men who run it know exactly how many hours a given fish will hold against a given quantity of ice in a given season, a calculation I have never seen written down anywhere, and every one of them carries entirely in his head. The salesmen work in a language largely their own, a market. Shorthand of numbers and abbreviations called out and answered faster than an outsider can follow, and a fortune changes hands, box by box, crate by crate, in transactions sealed on nothing more than a word and a reputation that would collapse entirely the first time either was broken. I find this more remarkable than most of what passes for high finance in this city, conducted as it is behind mahogany doors with a great deal more ceremony and, I suspect, rather less actual trust. The smell is exactly what you would expect, and I will not dwell on it further than to say that the men working in it stop noticing it within the first week of the trade, and never mention it again, which is either admirable or simply human, and possibly both. A boy of perhaps 13, employed to run empty boxes back to a particular stall before they are missed, moves through the crowd with the same unhurried certainty as the porters 3 times his age, having, I gather, worked this market since he was old enough to be trusted not to drop anything expensive, which is a kind of apprenticeship this city does not write diplomas for and ought, in fairness, to. By the time I've walked the short distance west to Covent Garden, the flower and vegetable trade there is stirring into its own version of the same organised uproar, though gentler in tone and considerably more fragrant. Growers have brought produce in by cart through the night from market gardens on the city's edge, and under the glass and iron roof of the piazza, itself now some 60 years old, and still, I think, one of the more handsome pieces of practical architecture this city has produced. Stallholders are arranging cabbages and carrots into pyramids with a geometric precision that owes nothing to art and everything to the plain commercial fact that a badly stacked stall sells worse than a well-stacked one, whatever the quality of what is underneath. A flower seller, setting out violets still damp from the walk-in, arranges them by some private logic of colour and size that I could not have reconstructed if my life depended on it, and does so from memory and habit rather than any conscious calculation, the same faculty a chemist uses to reach for the correct reagent without looking at the shelf. I do not romanticize the flower girls of this market. Their trade is harder and colder than any ballad about them lets on, but I will say that the arrangement of a stall before dawn done well is a genuine small art, practiced daily by people who would be startled to hear it called one. A porter here works under a licensed badge, numbered and recorded, so that a grower whose crate goes astray in the crowd has some means of tracing it back to the man who carried it. A system of accountability built, like so much of this city's night economy, on the assumption that most men are honest and a small number are not, and designed to catch the second group without insulting the first. I watched one such porter settle a dispute over a missing crate in under a minute, entirely by memory, reciting the order in which he had carried 6 separate loads that morning, without consulting a single note. A feat of recall that would not disgrace a barrister, and earns him, at the end of a long night, considerably less than one. Produce here is sold largely by measure rather than by count. Bushel baskets and half sieves whose exact capacity is fixed by long custom, and occasionally checked, I am told, by an inspector with a set of standard measures against which a suspect basket may be tested. Another quiet safeguard. The ordinary shopper who eventually buys a pound of the same apples at a street barrow will never once have cause to think about. A grower selling short measure more than once does not sell here again, which is a harsher and considerably swifter penalty than most courts of law would trouble to impose, and rather more effective for it. 3 consecutive facts about this market and no more, as is my rule. The roof is glass and iron, some 60 years standing. The trade runs almost entirely on credit settled at week's end. The busiest hour is the one before most Londoners have opened their eyes. I will put you back in a doorway now rather than give you a fourth. I stand a moment under an awning at the edge of the piazza, out of a rain that has by now mostly stopped, though the awning still drips at even intervals from water it collected earlier, a small percussion of its own beneath the general noise of the market. Smithfield, the meat market, lies a further walk to the east, past streets that have shifted, in the space of perhaps 10 minutes walking, from the scent of violets to something considerably less floral, and I will not pretend the sight of it appeals to me in the way the flower market does, so I will pass through it briefly, and without the detail I have given the others, because there is a line between honest description and dwelling on a thing for effect, and I intend to stay on the correct side of it. The market hall itself, a large structure of iron and glass built some 30 years ago, to bring an old and disorderly trade under one roof and off the surrounding streets, receives meat through the night by rail and cart so that the day's business, butchers buying for their own shops across the city, can begin at an hour that suits the butcher rather than the supplier. The porters here carry a particular local name, bummeries, a word whose origin nobody I have asked has ever been able to give me with any confidence, and they work under a system of licensed carrying, not unlike the one at Billingsgate, and with the same unglamorous essential competence. A market inspector moves between the stalls at intervals through the night, examining carcasses for anything a buyer further down the chain would have no means of checking for himself, a public safeguard most of the city never thinks about because it has simply never once had reason to. He carries no lantern of his own, working instead by the market's own gaslight, and signs a book at the end of his round exactly as the constable and the watchman do theirs, which I note only to observe that this city's entire nocturnal machinery seems to run, at bottom, on the same handful of habits repeated in different uniforms, a fixed round, a checked book, and a man willing to do both without an audience. The market hall itself, iron ribs and glass overhead in the same idiom as the fruit market I have just come from, was raised because the older, open arrangement of the trade had become plainly unworkable for a city of this size. Meat and offal and everything attending them once handled on ordinary streets in a manner the parish vestries of the time found, with good reason, increasingly intolerable. Bringing the trade under one roof with drainage and ventilation built in rather than added afterward was an improvement nobody thanked the engineers for at the time, and everybody in the surrounding streets has quietly benefited from ever since. I will let that stand as the whole of my comment on the trade and move on. Certain public houses in this immediate district hold a license of their own kind, granted specifically on account of the markets, permitting them to open at an hour that would see any ordinary publican summoned before the magistrates, since a market porter finishing a night's carrying at 5 in the morning has, by any reasonable accounting, reached his own evening, and is entitled to the same glass of beer any other tradesman would take at the end of an ordinary day, whatever the clock outside happens to say about it. I find this a small, sensible piece of legislative accommodation, made by people who evidently understood that a market runs on its own clock, and had the good sense not to force it onto the cities. Nearby, and this pleases me rather more, a bakehouse has its ovens already hours into their work. Bread for the morning cannot be baked in the morning, which is a fact so obvious once stated that I am almost embarrassed to state it, and yet I would wager a fair sum that most people who buy a loaf at 8 have never once considered that the man who made it began his night's work while they were still at the theatre. Regulation now limits the hours a young person may be kept at this trade, a change I note with approval and no further comment, since approval delivered at length curdles into something less useful than approval delivered plainly. The men who remain at the ovens through the small hours work in heat that would be oppressive in any season, and is, on a night as damp as this one, almost welcome, and they judge the readiness of an oven and the doneness of a loaf by eye, by smell, and by a kind of learned instinct for timing that no clock on the wall could improve upon, since the clock does not know what the dough is doing, and the baker does. The bakehouse runs on a small hierarchy that took me some years of occasional conversation to understand properly, a master baker who owns the ovens and the reputation attached to them, and beneath him 2 or 3 journeymen who do most of the actual work of the night, each responsible for a stage of the process rather than the whole of it, so that dough mixed and left to prove by one man is shaped and baked by another some hours later, a division of labour that lets the ovens run continuously rather than sitting idle, while a single baker attends to every stage himself. The master baker's own contribution, on the night I watched him, was mostly a matter of walking the length of the bakehouse at intervals, touching approving dough here, checking an oven's heat there with the back of his hand held near the door rather than inside it, correcting nothing so much as confirming, which is its own kind of skill and a rarer one than the doing, since it requires knowing exactly what correct looks like well enough to recognize it without needing to test it directly. I am given a heel of bread still too hot to hold comfortably, by a baker who offers it without being asked and without expecting thanks, which I give him anyway, briefly, because it is owed, and because I have found that a word of genuine thanks costs the giver nothing, and is worth rather more to the receiver than its cost would suggest. Somewhere near this junction of markets there is, at nearly every hour of the night, a coffee stall, a barrow with an urn kept hot by a small charcoal fire beneath it, a few tin mugs, a plank across 2 trestles for a counter, and a keeper who has been standing at it, in all weathers, for longer than most of his customers have held their own present employment. A cup of coffee, or of something the trade calls coffee and chemistry might dispute, costs a penny, and for that penny a market porter, a night constable finishing his beat, a cabman between fares, and on occasion a consulting detective with no better excuse for being awake than curiosity, may stand at the same plank in the same weather and receive the same small, entirely reliable comfort. I have had better coffee. I've rarely had coffee that did more work for its price. The urn itself is a substantial thing of tinned copper, kept simmering rather than boiling, with a tap at its base worn smooth and slightly discoloured by years of the same thumb working the same lever, and the keeper feeds his little fire beneath it with the economy that comes from having calculated long ago precisely how much coke a night's trade actually requires and refusing, on principle, to burn a scrap more. Bread and butter, cut thick, sits under a cloth beside a wedge of plain cake, and a man may have either for a penny more, though most of the custom at this hour wants nothing but the coffee itself, held in both hands, more for the warmth of the cup than any great thirst for what is in it. The keeper knows most of his regular custom by name, and a good many of their circumstances besides, whose wife is unwell, whose horse has gone lame, who lost a place last week and needs the coffee more than he can afford it, in which case, I noticed, the penny was somehow not collected and nothing was said about it by either party. This is not charity performed for an audience. There is no audience at 4:30 in the morning beyond the people it is meant for, which is, I think, the only kind of charity that counts for very much. You will have known someone like this yourself, I suspect, even if the trade was different and the hour was daylight. A person whose real business is not the goods sold, but the steadiness of being there, in the same place, at the same hour, for longer than anyone thought to be grateful for. The sky over the city has gone from black to a colour I can only call charcoal, which is not yet dawn but is undeniably no longer night, and the character of the streets is beginning, subtly, to change with it. A parish scavenging cart comes down the main road at walking pace, 2 men working ahead of it with broad brooms, clearing the accumulated mud and horse droppings of the previous day's traffic into neat ridges the cart then collects, a task performed on the principal thoroughfares every night of the year, so that the first omnibus of the morning need not plough through the last of the evening's mess. Nobody thanks a road for being clean. Nobody thinks about it at all, which is, as I believe I have now said in one form or another about every trade tonight, precisely the mark of the work having been done properly, and I will not apologise for repeating the observation, since the city itself repeats the arrangement every single night without complaint. A lamplighter is at work along the far side of the street, moving from post to post with a long pole tipped with a hook, extinguishing each lamp in turn rather than lighting it, since his morning round is the mirror of his evening one, and considerably less remarked upon. A lamp going out at dawn drawing no eye the way a lamp flaring a light at dusk does. He covers perhaps 100 lamps in a morning round of this kind, on foot, at a steady unhurried pace that has clearly been calibrated over years to arrive at the last lamp exactly as full daylight renders it unnecessary, no earlier and no later, which is a precision I recognise and rather admire, having built something of a career on precisely that quality myself. He is employed by the gas company rather than the parish, paid by the lamp rather than the hour, which gives him every incentive to hurry, and none whatsoever to hurry carelessly, since a lamp left burning into full daylight by an over-hasty round is noticed and deducted from his account at the week's end. He climbs a short ladder kept slung across his shoulder, for the lamp's too high to reach with the pole alone, an awkward, top-heavy piece of equipment that he manages with the unconscious ease of a man who has carried nothing else for a very long time, and does not so much as glance up at the lamp before extinguishing it, having long since stopped needing to look at a thing to know exactly how to reach it. 2 streets further on, a chimney sweep is setting up outside a house whose kitchen fire has not yet been lit, since a chimney can only be swept cold, and a household wants its fire going the moment the sweep is finished and gone. He carries brushes and jointed rods rather than sending a boy up the flue, a change in the trade brought about by an Act of Parliament now some 20 years old, which finally gave the practice of climbing boys the force of law behind its prohibition rather than merely the disapproval of reformers, and I record this without further comment except to say that a law which took as long as this one did to be properly enforced is nothing to be smug about, only something to be glad of, plainly, once. He works the rods up in short jointed lengths, screwing each new section on as the brush advances, judging the flue's condition by the resistance in his own wrist rather than by anything he can see, since he can see nothing at all above the second joint. A soot bag is tied loosely across the fireplace opening to catch what falls, and the whole operation is finished, chimney swept top to bottom, in a good deal less time than it has taken me to describe it, a compression of skilled effort into a brief unremarkable visit that the household will register only as an inconvenience to be endured before breakfast, rather than as the small feat of controlled blind labour it actually represents. A laundress, in a house 2 doors along, has her copper already lit and her first load steeping, a household's washing being impossible to get clean, dried, and pressed in a single working day, unless the earliest hours of it are spent at the boiling and not the ironing. And I have watched this trade closely enough on other nights to know that the strength required to lift a sodden sheet from a copper of boiling water, repeatedly for hours, is a strength that would surprise anyone who has only ever seen the finished folded result delivered to a door. It is called unskilled labour by people who have never tried it. I would not care to try it myself for a full morning, and I do not say that of every trade I observe. A short walk beyond the single household I have just described, a steam laundry of some size is further into the same work by several hours, its boilers lit well before midnight so that the first loads are already through the mangle by the time an ordinary household copper is still coming to the boil. A dozen or more women work here through the night in a heat and a noise that neither of us would find pleasant to stand in for very long. Feeding sheets through rollers with a rhythm timed precisely to avoid the rollers themselves. An injury, I am told, is rare, chiefly because everyone in the room understands exactly how little margin for inattention the machine allows. It is hard, hot, monotonous. Work, done at an hour that guarantees it will never be watched by anyone whose good opinion might make it easier, and I record it here for that reason and no other. A milk cart comes round the corner at a smart trot, churns rattling faintly against their fastenings, and stops at 3 doors in the space of as many minutes, the roundsman measuring milk into jugs left out on the step with a ladle. He does not appear to need to look at. A small daily choreography repeated at several hundred doors before his round is done and repeated again tomorrow, in the same order, at very nearly the same minute, because a household that expects its milk at 6:10 grows uncharitable toward a roundsman who arrives at 20 past. I find, standing at this corner in the first grey suggestion of real daylight, that I have been out and walking for the better part of 6 hours, which is longer than I generally admit to anyone, myself included. This particular corner I notice only now is one I stood at some hours ago, near the very start of tonight's account, when a constable nodded to me under a lamp still doing battle with the rain. The rain lost some time ago. The lamp itself will be out within the half-hour, extinguished by a lamplighter I may or may not have already described to you, and the constable, if it is even the same man, has long since finished his beat and gone home to whatever bed and however many hours of daylight sleep his own trade allows him. The rain has gone entirely now. Only damp remains, on the stone, on the railings, on the wool of my own coat, and even that will be gone within the hour. A cat crosses the street ahead of me without hurrying, entirely unconcerned by a city-changing shift around it, which strikes me at this hour as the only sensible attitude available to anyone. Outside a newsagent's still-shuttered front, a bundle of papers has already been dropped, tied with string, waiting for the boy who will open the shop and cut them free before most of the street has properly woken. Somewhere across the city a news vendor is collecting his own morning stack, the same sheets I watched come off the press some hours ago, the whole distance between that composing room and this doorstep, covered while I was standing at a coffee stall thinking about something else entirely. A shutter comes down 2 doors along, dragged up rather than down, iron rattling against its runners in a way that would be an intrusion at any other hour, and is, at this one, simply the sound of a shop agreeing to exist for another day. The grocer inside nods to me through the gap before the shutter has fully cleared, an unremarkable courtesy between 2 men neither of whom has any particular reason to be awake this early except that the trade requires it of one and curiosity requires it of the other. I stop for a moment and do nothing at all. This is rarer for me than you might expect. A coal cart passes, heading for the area steps of a large house further along, the coalman and his mate hauling sacks down a chute into the cellar with a practised heave that raises a small cloud of black dust. Neither man troubles to notice any longer, delivering fuel that will be feeding the household's kitchen range within the hour, and its drawing-room fires by the time the family comes down. It is unglamorous, filthy, and entirely necessary work, performed before the street is properly awake precisely so that nobody in the house need ever see it being done, which I suspect is exactly how the household prefers it, and exactly the arrangement I have found, in one form or another, behind almost everything comfortable this city offers by daylight. A crossing sweeper, a boy of perhaps 11 or 12, is already at his post at the muddiest junction on the street, broom in hand, ready to clear a path through the worst of the night's mud for whichever early passer-by is inclined to reward him a halfpenny for the service. It is not a trade with much dignity attached to it by the people who benefit from it, and I have always thought that a poor reflection on the people rather than the boy, who performs a genuinely useful piece of work cheerfully before most of the city he serves has so much as opened its eyes. Behind him, the street is filling, slowly, the way a basin fills from a tap left barely open. Not a rush, but a steady, cumulative arrival of people who were not there a quarter of an hour ago, and will, within another hour, have made the night's population entirely invisible beneath the days. The cabmen from the shelter I stood beside some hours back are still out, or others exactly like them are. The constable's beat has changed hands with the shift, one tired man replaced by a fresher one at a corner. Neither of them will ever think to consider historic. The bakers are drawing their first trays. The newspaper I watch being set in type at 2 is, by now, very probably lying folded on 100,000 breakfast tables read for 4 minutes and set aside, its night's labour entirely unremarked. I said, at the start of tonight's account, that a very considerable fraction of this city is on its feet between midnight and 6, and I have not, in the hours since, found any reason to revise the claim, only rather more evidence for it than I had when I made it. A constable, a cabman, a night sister, a sorter, a compositor, a porter, a baker, a stall-keeper, a lamplighter, a sweep, a laundress, a roundsman, a boy with a broom. None of them extraordinary. Each of them, in his or her own narrow trade, entirely reliable, and the whole of it stitched together into a machine so quietly efficient that its only reward most mornings is that nobody notices it running at all. I will make you one admission before I stop, since I have made you rather fewer than I have asked you to make of your own attention tonight. I do not, in truth, sleep especially well at any hour. I've come to prefer these particular ones, not because they hold any mystery worth solving, since I have made a point tonight of showing you that they hold none, but because they are in their way honest. Nobody performing this work between midnight and 6 is doing it to be seen. There is no audience at 3:30 in the morning beyond the people the work is actually for, and I find, more than I once expected to, that this suits me rather better than an audience does. The sky continues its slow argument with the night, losing it by degrees rather than all at once. Somewhere behind me a second church clock, no better synchronized with the first than it was 6 hours ago, begins to strike an hour. I will let it finish striking without me. I have kept you up long enough already. The streets do not need my account of themselves to go on functioning. They have managed it every morning for longer than either of us has been alive to notice it, and they will manage tomorrow's without any assistance from me. The cabman I stood beside will drive home soon and sleep through the better part of the daylight, in a room he keeps dark for exactly that purpose. The night sister will hand her ward to the day staff at 7 and walk home against the current of everyone else's morning. The baker will be asleep before most of London has eaten the bread he made, and will not think even once to consider that strange. I am going home myself. Baker Street will still be there. The kettle, if I have banked the fire correctly before leaving it, will not take very long to boil. The landlady will not be up for another hour yet, and I intend to have the fire drawing again before she is. A small courtesy that costs me nothing, and saves her 1 match's worth of trouble on a morning that will, I have no doubt, bring her plenty of trouble of its own kind. My rooms, when I reach them, will be exactly as I left them some 7 hours ago, which is more than can be said for the city I've spent those 7 hours walking through, though I suppose the two states are not so different as they first appear, a room and a city both being, in the end, only as settled as the last person to leave them chose to make them. I will sit by the window a while before I sleep, as is my habit, and watch the last of what I have described tonight finish its handover to the ordinary daylight version of itself, cabs giving way to omnibuses, night sisters giving way to day ones, the whole machine quietly changing its clothes without ever once stopping. The city behind me will go on precisely as I have described it, tonight and every night, whether or not anyone troubles to watch it do so, which is, I have come to think, the surest mark of a thing done properly. I will leave it here then, at the edge of a morning that has already begun without either of us needing to watch it further. There is nothing left to observe tonight that has not already been observed by someone in this city tonight and every night before it. The city has this hour well in hand. It has had it in hand for longer than anyone troubled to write down, and it will have it in hand again tomorrow, whoever happens to be awake to see it.